Hi, my name is Rich Goodson. I'm a solutions architect at BlueCat Networks, and in this video, I will be showing you how to create an overlay view so that you can modify DNS responses for a subset of your users. To derive benefit from this video, you will need a basic understanding of DNS concepts like zones and resource records, as well as a understanding of the dig command, which I'll be using to look up DNS answers. I've had customers who need a DNS server to give different answers for just a few records to a subset of clients while still providing the same answers as production for the rest of the environment. An example of this would be in a DR testing environment where you would need to provide different answers for your DR failover servers, but then you still need to provide normal production DNS responses for the rest of the environment. That explanation might have been a little bit confusing, so let's look at an example first. In this example, we have a DNS server with 2 zones and a few records. We also have 2 clients. We want to give slightly different answers to client B than to client A. We could copy all of the zones in the default view to a new view, then we make changes to that view and then have our clients resolve from that new view. That would work fine. But when the data in the default view updates, the new view doesn't update with it because it's a copy. Any changes that you make in the default view that you also want to make in the new view have to be explicitly made in both views. Instead, we can create an overlay view with a response policy. This way, any records that we haven't explicitly added, changed, or deleted still resolve out of the default view. To do this, we add a view with a response policy. This view then forwards to localhost. For clients that match this overlay view, any records that are in this view will get answered out of it, but anything that's not explicitly in this view will get forwarded back to localhost and then get answered out of the default view. In this case, our match clients option only points to a single IP since we're testing, but this could just as easily be one or more networks, or if you have a server in your DR environment that's dedicated, you can just overlay this view on one or more of your servers without a match client statement. So client B sees the overlay view plus the default view, but client A still sees the default view. If we make updates to the default view, client A sees them, but with this solution, client B also sees the updates. If we had just copied the zones over to a new view and then made changes, we would have to manually update both views. But since we're overlaying one view on top of the other, both clients see this updated record automatically. So client B sees the overlay view plus the default view, which is a benefit because production environments are constantly changing. Okay, so let's get to it. First, let's have a look at this environment that we're starting with before we change it. This is a pretty simple demo environment. We currently have a single view called default. There are 2 zones in this default view. There's example.com and bluecatlabs.net. Inside of bluecatlabs.net, we have 4 resource records: BAM, Edge, changed record, and deleted record. They all point to 192.168.1.2. We have a single deployment role pointing to ns1.bluecatlabs.net. And then the only deployment options we have are to enable recursion on this server. So to make changes to the answers that we give, we need to create a new view. And it doesn't have to be called this, but I recommend something descriptive. I'm calling it overlay. So this overlay view also needs a deployment role. So we will add a role on the same server where we have the default view. And then we need some deployment options. The first option I'm going to add is the forwarding option. And this is what makes this overlay view be able to answer its clients with records from the default view, because anything that we don't explicitly know about, we forward back to localhost. But since we have forwarding enabled, we need to set a forwarding policy because forwarding defaults to forwarding first. And we want to make sure that we are not doing our own recursion out of this overlay view, that absolutely everything forwards to localhost. Next, we want to determine who gets answers out of this view. So for testing purposes, on my laptop, I have 2 interfaces. I have a wired interface at 1.171, and I have a wireless interface at 1.173. For matches to this overlay view, I'm going to use my wireless interface. So any queries that come from 172.31.3.173 will get answers out of this overlay view. Any queries that come from anywhere else will match that default view. So since response policies are a recursive operation, we also need to allow recursion to the clients that we service out of this overlay view. And then our response policy statement is where the magic really happens. And so we create a response policy, and we have two zones. We have an additions zone. This is where any adds or changes will be made. And then this zone deletions has a policy of NX domain. And so anything that's in this deletions zone, any records that are there will get a synthesized NX domain response. And we'll see that here in a minute. So now we need to add some zones to our overlay view, and they need to match our response policy statement that we just made. So I'm going to make an additions zone, and we need to make sure that they are deployable because top level domains default to non-deployable. And I'm going to create a deletions. And it's important that they be spelled correctly. And that one is also deployable. So in this additions zone, I'm going to create some resource records. And I'm going to create one to show changes. And I'm going to make a different IP than that changed record.bluecatlabs.net in the default view. And then I'm going to add a record that's not in the default view. And that is added record. And so clients that match the default view will not see this added record.bluecatlabs.net, and clients in the default view will see changed record resolving to 192.168.1.2. So now let's go back to our deletion zone and add a record there for a record that exists in the default view, but that we are going to synthesize an NX domain response for. And in the default view, this resolves to 192.168.1.2, but the IP addresses don't have to match. As long as the label is the same, this record will have an NX domain response synthesized for it. So now all we have to do is deploy our changes to our server and test. So first, I'm going to show what we get from our default view. And I'm going to use the -B flag to dig to specify the interface that the queries come from. So as if you remember, we had our match clients and our overlay view only matching 172.31.3.173. So these results are coming back from the default view. So test.example.com is resolving to 192.168.1.1. BAM.bluecatlabs.net and all of the other resource records that exist in BlueCatLabs.net all resolve to 192.168.1.2. Now, added record.bluecatlabs.net, if you remember, did not exist in the default view, and so we get no answer for that. So now let's look at the answers that we get from the overlay view. And now our -B flag is set to 172.31.3.173. So these queries are coming from the wireless interface. Now, test.example.com and bam.bluecatlabs.net resolve back to the same IP addresses that they resolved to out of the default view because of that forwarding that we're doing to localhost. But changed record.bluecatlabs.net resolves to a different IP than it does in the default view. And added record.bluecatlabs.net exists in this overlay view, does not exist in the default view. Whereas deleted record.bluecatlabs.net existed over here in the default view and resolved to 192.168.1.2, but out of the overlay view, we are synthesizing an NX domain response. So in this video, I showed you a way to make your DNS server give different responses for some records to one set of DNS clients versus another, while still being able to resolve everything else in your environment automatically. Response policies can be very powerful, and this is just one example of what they can do.